Hello and welcome back. It's Hooves of Doom. And I'm a little bit behind, I guess, on this, but with the relaunch of White Dwarf, I thought I'd make a short video describing my thoughts on the magazine in general. So, back when I first started playing tabletop wargaming and Warhammer 40k, I remember very distinctly, those first few games. And one of the things I remember very clearly is buying my first White Dwarf, and that was issue 235. And starting from about 244 onwards, I really bought almost every single issue thereon. But the first issue was a very kind of a pivotal point in my hobby because it marked the point where I truly became immersed and invested in the game. Right? When you read White Dwarf, it's on your mind. You see all the new models. You see people, other people enjoying the hobby from around the world, and it provides you with a really sense of inspiration. And in some sense, I think my hobby journey began with White Dwarf in earnest. And that is especially true if you have an interest, I guess, in multiple Games Workshop games. And especially if you play both the core games, as I kind of do. I certainly have an interest in both. So since the early 2000s, I bought or subscribed to every issue of White Dwarf. And I always look forward to the magazine. Not only was it just information about the new models, it's just an interesting and always kind of a good read. So, as a Warhammer collector, White Dwarf became a form of printed history in some sense. It really is the best method to track and catalog the growth and development of Games Workshop and Warhammer. If you want to know when a model is released, White Dwarf is a great source of information. So they kind of retain their value for me personally, even though maybe the rules or the articles are a little bit more obsolete over the years. Models, for instance, they're only on the website for maybe a few years. In some instances, they can be on there for, you know, there are certainly models on the website that have been on there for a very long time. But there are others, for example, if they come out with an exclusive model or a board game or something like that, they're only on the website for a very short time. And Games Workshop catalogs have been kind of irregular at best since about 2000. So I use White Dwarfs as kind of a way to track the history of the hobby. So collecting White Dwarf can be a little bit, especially, it's a little bit odd to kind of collect White Dwarf, and it's not necessarily that easy, especially if you're living in the UK, or rather if you're not living in the UK or US. Because the number sequence can be a little bit confusing and irregular. So as a Canadian, I bought the US version of White Dwarf. That was what I could buy at the Canadian stores, which is a little bit different, than the version in the UK. But then eventually they started to come out with these like this little mini White Dwarf that went alongside the US one as a package. And that had information about the hobby community in Canada. And then eventually they came out with the Canadian White Dwarf. And kind of, as a collector, it was kind of annoying because they started the issue off at 1 again. So, like, some of the content would be, from, I don't know, issue, like the Canadian issue and the American issue were completely different numbers at that point, which is, as a collector, just kind of frustrating. So when I moved to the States, I got back to that old numbering sequence. But they eventually kind of dropped that altogether, and as many of you know, the last year or two of White Dwarf was purely by month and year, and they didn't have a number. On occasion, I pick up older issues of White Dwarf that predate my time in the hobby. And in fact, just this past month, I picked up, I think 8 or so issues from the early 80s that even predate Warhammer itself, they're really interesting. I haven't actually really looked through them that carefully yet, but I'll hope to do that in the next week or so. It looks really interesting. I've actually thought about doing a video series on White Dwarf, probably 1 year in review as opposed to the individual issues. Um, but I don't know if anyone's really interested in that in-depth look at the magazine. It'd be more like looking at the models that were released in a particular year. So when the monthly issues stopped in early 2014, I wasn't quite sure what to do. I collect a lot of weird things that others would probably simply throw away. So here's the piece of paper that accompanied one of the last monthly White Dwarfs that announced weekly White Dwarf and Warhammer Visions. And I bought every issue of the weekly White Dwarf for about the first year, but I never actually subscribed. And I eventually stopped altogether, with the exception of the odd issue. If it included material that was a little bit unique, or like a pin or something. It had to be something special for me to actually buy it. I think the strength of the old monthly White Dwarf relied on its a depth of coverage, the releases, the different articles, the different games, the painting, the modeling, the gaming, all contained in one magazine. The weekly White Dwarf simply lacked that type of content, and it's kind of understandable. I mean, it's coming out every single week. But I think as a result, for me, it just became purely a promotion for the week's releases. And most of that information was available kind of elsewhere. You could just go on the Games Workshop website or whatnot. That said, I still think the weekly White Dwarf does have a place in my collection. Basically, as I was mentioning before, about a way to track the history of the hobby. But the subscription of the weekly was a little bit steep. Obviously, if you're mailing every single week, it involves a bit more postage, so the price is a bit higher, and there's more issues per month. In addition to Warhammer Visions, which I was buying also, it just meant that like what I was spending before, which is probably $8 or $9 on a magazine, now was about 2 to 3 times that, and it just wasn't worth it for me to continue doing it. I know that some people really like the weekly version, but I'm really thrilled to have the monthly back, and I immediately subscribed to it. So GW is really trying to generate interest in the new White Dwarf. They had that free model in the first issue. The second issue, I believe, has a comic. And if you've watched my recent videos, you know that I'll be... I really love the Warhammer comics, so I think that's awesome. I can't wait to get a hold of that. And I think one of the forthcoming issues has a promotional White Dwarf for Warhammer Total War. I think that's the November issue. But I mean, so far the first 3 issues have all had something a little bit unique in them, well worth the money in my mind. And this is an excellent start. And I'm looking forward to more content and goodies with future issues. However, it hasn't quite been all smooth sailing. If you're a U.S. subscriber to White Dwarf, you'll probably know that there was a huge delay in getting the White Dwarf to at your home and in the mailbox. I guess the U.S. Postal Service rejected the initial import from the U.K. So there was a rather long delay. I only actually just got my first issue last week. And I waited patiently by my mailbox to no avail. I watched people on Twitter and YouTube talk about how much they enjoyed their issue with a little bit of envy. It all worked out in the end, though. I corresponded with GW about the delay on a few occasions, and they actually sent me an issue directly from in the mail as its own order, and that actually arrived before the subscription issue arrived. So now I have 2 copies, so which is kind of nice. But hopefully I'll receive the October issue soon. But I guess I'm living out west, and it takes a little while to arrive. But anyways, I'm really excited to have the monthly White Dwarf back, and reading through those articles and really just enjoying it for what it is, and accumulating another large collection of white dwarfs. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a good one.